Beliefs about vampires, werewolves, witches, and wizards are widespread.
Exactly what is a serial killer?
Our house was 2 rooms, and there was 7 of us.
He held the bat like this.
That's why I have characters who sort of expose themselves.
And everybody always say, Coach Carter, Samuel Jackson is taller than you. I said, I know, but I think I'm better looking.
Thank you very much, Dr. Summers. Thank you, Sam, for inviting me, and thanks to you and your staff for organizing this and ensuring that everything has gone off so far smoothly. Quote, half of Louisiana is underwater and the other half is under indictment. This quip, attributed to ex-congressman and big pharma lobbyist Billy Tozan, summarizes a common view that when it comes to politics, the Pelican State is egregiously corrupt. Residents of other states adopt a kind of thank God for Mississippi line. However rotten their own politics, it will always be worse in Louisiana. A recently retired FBI agent put it like this. He said, the prevalent attitude seemed to be, hey, I'm in an office and I'm going to make what I can get. Veteran politician Bill Dodd admitted as much in his 1991 memoirs. Yes, he wrote, there were some honest elected officials, but, quote, a big-time politician who failed to get rich and make his friends rich has been considered stupid. From Louisiana's first days in the Union, public officials set about enriching themselves with what historian Joe Tragle called piratical exuberance. Looking at the Jacksonian era, Tragle was astonished at the sheer scale of malfeasance. During Reconstruction, legislators openly traded their votes for cash on the floor of the legislature, or perhaps for company stock. 2 Republican governors, Henry Clay Warmoth and William Pitt Kellogg, used more subtle but equally shady means of making themselves wealthy. Congressional investigating committees were appalled at the ethical swamp of Louisiana politics. As Ben Butler of Massachusetts put it, and Butler was hardly a model of probity himself, quote, they do things differently here. When looking at the state's politics, he explained, one must constantly keep in mind, quote, the inertia of conscience in Louisiana politicians. It'd be nice to report that the redemption of the state from Republican rule in 1877 marked a return to honest government, but there is no tradition of honest government to return to. The Democrats, with a monopoly on power maintained by electoral fraud, violence, and the disfranchisement of black voters, helped themselves. Advocates of honest government were occasionally elected, but their impact was minimal. Huey Long took corruption to a new level and gave it a new twist. Jacking up taxes on Standard Oil, he turned state government into a public benefactor, providing highways, toll-free bridges, free school textbooks, and improved charity hospitals. He also forged an alliance with Frank Costello, allowing the New York mobster to operate illegal casinos and to import thousands of equally illegal slot machines. As political commentator John McGuinness put it, Long revolutionized Louisiana politics by taking from the rich, keeping some of it for himself and his friends, and giving more to the poor than government ever had before. After Long's death, however, his followers turned Louisiana into a kleptocracy. The stealing became so rampant that the federal government stepped in. Governor Dick Lesh, bagman Seymour Weiss, and LSU President James Jingle Pocket Smith all went to jail. Hundreds of others were indicted, 4 of whom committed suicide. Earl Long served 2 full terms as governor and was shrewd enough not to steal from the public treasury. But his FBI file revealed Earl to be, to quote his biographers, a man on the take, a politician who didn't hesitate to accept bribes and engage in wholesale graft. Like Huey, he profited from the gambling operations of Costello, now assisted by local crime boss Carlos Marcello. Sheriffs were vital cogs in Earl Long's corrupt political machine. Men like Frank King Clancy of Jefferson Parish and DJ Cat Doucette of St. Landry Parish shared in the profits of gambling and prostitution. I won't explain how Cat Doucette got his nickname, but it had something to do with prostitution. But the uncrowned king of corruption was undoubtedly Leander Perez. For half a century, the dictator, and that is not too strong a term, of Plaquemine Parish. By manipulating the lease of oil and sulfur-rich public land, Perez siphoned off an estimated $82 million that should have gone into the parish treasury. Now, one theory about corruption in Louisiana is that the state is a banana republic. Not literally, of course, but in the sense that its French, Spanish, and Catholic roots set it apart from the rest of the Union. McGuinness put it this way: while the American political experience derived from distrust of monarchs and centralized authority, Louisiana's political traditions grew out of European and Catholic attitudes of submission to authority and fealty to the king or the pope or both. Hence, the state's government was built around the banana republic principle of one strong man, accountable only to the vote of the people and unfettered by the checks and balances found in established democracies. But I think there's a problem here. Explanations that emphasize the exceptionalism of Louisiana are open to an obvious objection. Politicians in states like New York, Illinois, and even Alaska are almost as corrupt, and perhaps just as corrupt, as those in Louisiana. Before the 1970s, in fact, there was no metric, no statistics that would enable us to determine whether Louisiana was more or less corrupt than other states. Were Louisiana politicians more dishonest than those elsewhere? We have no way of knowing. What's more, when talking about corruption, we need to consider some mitigating factors. As far as the 19th century is concerned, behavior which would nowadays send a politician to prison didn't violate the law. Stealing public money was clearly a crime, but giving and taking bribes, insider trading, buying votes, and exchanging gifts for favors were all legal. Let me go further. Practices that we now regard as unethical or corrupt actually aided the development of mass democracy in the United States. Bribes and kickbacks fueled the party machines that managed the never-ending electoral cycle and brought a semblance of order to a convoluted governmental structure. The spoils system enabled parties to tithe government employees and mobilize them as election workers. It also provided training and opportunity for people of humble origins, producing brilliant politicians who cultivated the loyalty of working-class voters, especially immigrants, by befriending and helping them. The ward boss, often to be found in a saloon, might provide a job, a loan during hard times, a bucket of coal during a harsh winter, help with obtaining permits and licenses. There was no welfare state then, so such assistance meant a lot. You're talking about the late 19th, early 20th century. Bear in mind, too, that the mass of voters paid little in the way of direct taxation. There was no income tax before, when was it, 1912? The costs of corruption were mostly paid for by the wealthy. To the poor, the costs were indirect and invisible. So faced with a choice between smiling, open-handed bosses and scowling, tight-fisted reformers, voters more often than not opted for the former. Before the 1970s, the chances of a corrupt politician going to jail were about the same as his chances of being struck by lightning, perhaps less. The Department of Justice lacked the means, the machinery, the will, or the presidential backing to mount a serious attack on political corruption. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover was more interested in persecuting radicals and communists and persecuting black leaders. Prosecutions by state authorities were also rare. As McGuinness put it, local corrupt politicians had nothing to worry about as long as the Attorney General was Jack P.F. Gremillon. Gremillon, of whom Earl Long once said, if you want to hide something from Jack Gremillon, put it in a law book, served 4 consecutive terms. A federal court then convicted him over his dealings with the Louisiana Loan and Thrift Company, and he served 15 months in jail. Now, Gremillon's conviction was significant. Along with the jailing of Hugh Addonizio, a former mayor of Newark, New Jersey, and the bribery investigation that forced Spiro Agnew to resign as vice president, it showed that the federal government was finally beginning to take political corruption seriously. And then came Watergate, and after Watergate, public opinion demanded a political house cleaning. So the turning point comes really in 1976, when the Department of Justice created a public integrity section armed with federal anti-corruption laws, which had been strengthened by the RICO Act of 1970. The DOJ went on the attack. US attorneys received their marching orders. The FBI was eager to restore its tarnished reputation after the abuses of the Hoover years. And the FBI employed aggressive techniques, including undercover and sting operations, to snare crooked politicians. The results were startling. So these are convictions in federal court for corruption. This is the nation. It's not just Louisiana, it's the nation. But it's a startling rise from 1970 to 1980, reaching a peak in 1990. Interestingly, a decline under the Trump administration. Hundreds of Louisiana officials have been convicted of corruption, including some of the biggest fish in the political pond. I won't go through the list. Some of these names may be familiar to students, maybe not. These were very prominent. Michael O'Keefe, one of the most influential politicians in the state. 3 consecutive insurance commissioners going to jail. But people were finally getting caught, going to trial and being convicted, being sent to jail. That's simply a different way of presenting the figures. But they rise from a very low figure to a peak, gradually leveling off. That only goes up to 2010, by the way. Now, with statistics on convictions, we can finally make comparisons between states that are more than mere guesswork. And it turns out that, lo and behold, Louisiana heads the league table. Illinois coming in second, and I've got to say DC, which is now my current home, way ahead. But I think there are special factors and circumstances that account for that. Now, it would be comforting to report that the civil rights movement, which exuded democratic idealism, led to a cleansing of Louisiana's Augean stables. But the new class of black professional politicians played by the existing rules. And why shouldn't they? Having grown up seeing white politicians use public office for private gain, many of them naturally wanted in on the action. But lacking experience, the dishonest ones were less skilled at covering their tracks. Robert Collins, the first African American to be appointed to the federal bench in the South, was jailed for taking bribes from a marijuana dealer. William Jefferson, the first black congressman from Louisiana since Reconstruction, received a 13-year sentence for soliciting bribes from companies seeking to do business in Africa. It turned out that corruption was a Jefferson family business. A brother, 2 sisters, and a niece were also convicted. In 2003, the Times-Picayune drew hope from the election of Ray Nagin, who, quote, vowed to restore integrity to city government. But like many politicians who promised to throw out the crooks, Nagin was himself a crook. He's currently serving a 10-year sentence. The federal government's prosecutions, which in the mid-80s put Edwin Edwards in the dock twice, but he was acquitted twice, had contributed to one of those periodic bouts of reform that have interrupted business as usual. In 1988, after defeating Edwards, Buddy Romer created the State Office of Inspector General. He appointed Bill Lynch, a muckraking journalist, to head it. Lynch installed a fraud hotline and was promptly inundated with tips. In short order, his office investigated Southern University in New Orleans, Nicholls State University in Thibodaux, Delgado College, the Lafayette University Medical Center, the State Racing Board, and the State Real Estate Commission, and they found what might be expected: political patronage, general mismanagement, payroll abuse, and misappropriation of public funds for private use. Resignations and dismissals followed. Now, of course, a good number of politicians hated Bill Lynch. The state Senate passed a measure to weaken his independence. The bill's sponsor, William Jefferson, who complained that Lynch was harassing and intimidating state employees. The bill failed to become law, but Edwards, running for a fourth term in 1991, vowed to abolish the office. Well, he would, wouldn't he? However, after defeating Roma in the primary and now facing David Duke in the runoff, he wanted and needed Roma's endorsement. He received it on condition that he retain Lynch in office. But after taking office, Edwards barred the Inspector General from investigating colleges, universities, and most statewide elected officials. If Edwards clipped Lynch's wings, the Inspector General could at least bite or perhaps nip. In report after report, and all these are readily available online, many of these reports dealing with the various state boards and commissions, his office detailed waste, profligacy, nepotism, and sweetheart deals that cost the state untold millions of dollars. A fairly typical example was a report on the Louisiana Board of Massage Therapy. You might think, why do you need a Louisiana Board on Massage Therapy? But there is one. It found that the agency's executive director not only received a full-time salary, but also an additional $28,000 under a contract to inspect massage therapists. But she failed to document these inspections, and many that she claimed to have done, she never carried out. She also persuaded the board to hire her husband, children, and sister, despite a state law against nepotism. The records of the agency were in total disarray. Now, a trivial example perhaps, but indicative of the absence of oversight and the predatory attitude that characterized many of these boards and commissions. For many of their members, an appointment from the governor was not so much an opportunity for faithless public service, but a chance to make money. For example, the president of the Orleans Levee Board, James Huey, was entitled by law to receive a per diem of $75 a day for a maximum of 36 days a year. Instead, he awarded himself $1,000 a month, amounting to $91,000. And this was a reformer who replaced someone even worse. The board also spent, again, contrary to state law, $3.2 million on outside lawyers. This in the space of just 2 years, and despite the fact that the commission had its own full-time attorney. The sums wasted on dubious expenses were eye-watering. A report on the Lake Charles Port Commission noted that in 2002, the commission spent $350,000 on travel and entertainment. That included $26,000 on alcohol over and above dinner drinks. 11 commissioners attended the annual Mardi Gras Ball in Washington, D.C., under the guise of promoting economic development. They claimed $11,000 for the food and drink they dispensed at their hotel hospitality suite. The port's director of maintenance claimed a more modest $658 for attending a German beer night. A conference in Kansas City on food aid, sponsored by the federal government, induced 7 commissioners to claim $47,000 in expenses. $38,000 of that sum went on a reception in which 900 lamb chops and 1,200 alcoholic drinks were consumed. A legislative briefing in Baton Rouge soaked up $10,000, nearly all for food and alcohol. I've got to add, I'm not opposed to the provision of alcohol at state-sponsored events, you know, unlike Tennessee, where you can't do that. At a customer Christmas party, 435 guests guzzled their way through $4,000 worth of booze. 3 commissioners took their wives on a 17-day tour of the Northwest in a Port of Lake Charles van and put in a claim for $14,000 in expenses. Of course, what any of this expenditure had to do with the Port of Lake Charles was anyone's guess. Now, the work of the Inspector General was invaluable in exposing waste and mismanagement, but its terms of reference were restricted and its powers were limited. The boards and commissions were low-hanging fruit. elected officials treated the Inspector General as a minor nuisance and assumed that the public would soon tire of reform, as it usually did. The feds, however, were not letting up. Under the leadership of John Volz, Eddie Jordan, and Jim Letton, the US Attorney's Office kept the corruption issue front and center. The FBI investigated the New Orleans Police Department. They found officers shaking down drug dealers and protecting drug runners. It recorded one officer ordering a hit on a woman who had filed a complaint against him, and they recorded the officer whooping with joy when he learned that the murder had been carried out. The new millennium began with the conviction of Edwin Edwards, Insurance Commissioner Jim Brown, and Elections Commissioner Jerry Fowler. So Louisiana's had two governors who've gone to jail, and in this case, thank God for Illinois, who've had 4. The public was then treated to the spectacle of over 24 former employees of the Orleans Parish School Board pleading guilty to federal corruption charges. The extent of the rot in the New Orleans school system was staggering. Quote, corruption was so rampant that the FBI opened an office within the district's administration building. A payroll clerk indicted for stealing $250,000 had been employed despite a previous indictment for stealing from a bank. $70 million the district had received in federal grants could not be accounted for. Graft was ubiquitous from bus drivers all the way up to the school board. Employees regularly pilfered computers, band equipment, even air conditioners, as well as funds raised by students. The missing property totaled in the tens of millions of dollars. Bus drivers used their district-issued credit cards to sell fuel to truck drivers. Each year, payroll sent out hundreds of thousands of dollars in checks for unearned wages and benefits to terminated or dead employees. Officials who handled insurance contracts took bribes of over $300,000. The president of the school board, of course elected as a reformer, accepted $140,000 from a computer software company. Sorry for throwing out these figures, but you know, they're sort of staggering. In the past, voters had tolerated crooked politicians on the grounds that the corruption didn't really affect them. The politicians may have been on the take, but they were taking from the corporations and the casinos. Most voters had paid little in the way of state taxes. But times had changed. Oil revenues were down and state taxes were going up. And citizens were getting less for those taxes because public services provided by the state were being cut. The school board scandal laid to rest the myth of the Robin Hood who stole from the rich and gave to the poor. These crooks were stealing from one of the poorest school systems in the nation that served some of the poorest and most disadvantaged children. A single example. In January 2000, a freak hailstorm damaged the roofs of a dozen schools in New Orleans. The board awarded multi-million-dollar contracts to repair those roofs with no competitive bidding, no supervision, and no inspection of the work. The school board officials, the contractors, the subcontractors, the sub-subcontractors all took their respective cuts, and precious little money was left over for actual repairs, especially when roofers were ostensibly earning $81 an hour. Meanwhile, in neighboring Jefferson Parish, the FBI carried out what it called Operation Wrinkled Robe. It snared 2 elected judges and sent them to jail. Then came Katrina. And then came the theft of Katrina funds. According to the General Accounting Office, about $1 billion of the disaster relief funds, 16% of the total, went on fraudulent claims. Prison inmates, using post office boxes as addresses, received millions of dollars. One claimant lived in West Virginia, but gave his address as Greenwood Cemetery in New Orleans. FEMA gave another claimant over $2,000 in rental assistance, while also paying him $8,000 to stay in a hotel in Hawaii. FEMA debit cards were used to buy jewelry, Caribbean vacations, Saint season tickets, sex toys, a divorce lawyer, and a meal at Hooters that included a bottle of Dom Perignon. It's the finest champagne you can buy. Why not? GAO investigators went undercover to test the system. They had no trouble at all in securing checks of $2,000 from FEMA on the basis of false identities, fake addresses, and phony disaster stories. By 2011, the Disaster Fraud Task Force had prosecuted over 1,400 people. Just last year, Xavier University agreed to pay back $12 million it had received on the basis of false and misleading repair claims. The Archdiocese of New Orleans also paid back $1 million. The involvement of politicians, it made the frauds especially sickening. Those convicted included Sheriff Jeff Hingle of Plaquemines Parish, Councilman Joe Impastato of St. Tammany, and John Johnson of the New Orleans City Council, and of course Ray Nagin. For the citizens of Louisiana, the theft of Katrina relief funds was the last straw. Political corruption was no longer a matter to be laughed at or shrugged off. In 2008, Bobby Jindal, elected on an anti-corruption platform, put the Office of State Inspector General on a statutory basis. With an annual budget of $1.6 million and a staff of 13 people, it was granted subpoena power. Its new head, Stephen B. Street, repurposed the office to focus on criminal investigations. The state now became a full partner of the federal government in prosecuting crooked politicians, officials, and businessmen. Using informants, wiretaps, and secret cameras, the FBI helped convict Jefferson and Nagin. It exposed a corrupt ring in Jefferson Parish, headed by Parish President Aaron Broussard. Another FBI investigation led the US Senate to remove US District Judge Walter Porteous. Stephen Street is 2 years into his third 6-year term. The Inspector General business is not for the faint of heart, he confessed. His office takes on politically toxic investigations, the cases that are guaranteed to infuriate the very politicians who get to decide how much money you get in your annual budget. But Street has fended off 2 efforts in the state legislature to defund the office. And in contrast to New Jersey, where the office lasted barely 5 years before Chris Christie abolished it, Louisiana's Inspector General office has achieved a degree of permanence and is one of the most effective in the country. Since 2012, it has won convictions in 97% of the cases it has brought to federal court. The money it saves the state by identifying waste and fraud pays for its budget many times over. The Inspector General's report for 2017 provides a useful snapshot of its work. The office received 376 complaints and opened 60 investigations. It secured numerous convictions. A woman who stole Pell Grant funds from a school that she had headed. A man who raided a community development grant to pay for his children's cell phones, buy concert tickets, go on cruises. The mayor of New Roads, who allowed the town's financial officer, with whom he was having an affair, to use her city credit card to buy personal items. And the town clerk of Arcadia, who embezzled $39,000 over 3 years. The biggest scalp belonged to Walter Reed, the district attorney of St. Tammany and Washington parishes for 30 years. Not content with his $200,000 a year salary, Reed arranged side deals with the Causeway Commission, which paid him $52,000 a year for doing essentially nothing, and with the St. Tammany Parish Hospital, which over a period of 20 years paid him over $500,000 to which he was not entitled. Reed also pillaged his campaign chest of almost $3 million to give money to his son and to spend lavishly on meals and gifts for friends and supporters. See, my time is up. Imposing reform on the state legislature is much more difficult than convicting fraudsters and bribe takers. The new laws introduced in 2007 were hailed at the time as the gold standard of transparency. Outsiders are very impressed, but lawmakers quickly learned how to sidestep the rules. Hiding outside income, for example, which is supposed to declare, proved easy. For example, in 2016, State Senator Danny Martini was paid over $800,000 for representing the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office, but he only declared $13,000 because the rest of the money was routed to him indirectly via his law firm. The Louisiana Board of Ethics has turned out to be a paper tiger. Complaints against legislators take an average of 4 years to resolve. One is still open after 10 years. In 2015, the State Integrity Project placed Louisiana 41st in terms of anti-corruption oversight and declared that the 2008 ethics reforms had failed. So I'm coming to conclusion, and I'm going to say that this is actually true of ethics oversight throughout the country. The reality is that political corruption, public corruption, is an American problem, not just a Louisiana one. International studies place the United States at around, or used to place the United States at around 25 in the list of least corrupt countries. For comparison, New Zealand, Singapore, and the Scandinavian countries are the least corrupt, followed by the Netherlands, Germany, Luxembourg, the UK, Iceland, Austria, Canada, and Australia. The United States will probably always have more corruption than these countries for structural reasons. The enormous number of elective offices, the non-stop electioneering, and the absence of any effective limits on political spending provide more opportunities for corruption. At the same time, federalism, separation of powers, and checks and balances make it hard for the national government to impose reform from above. The creation of a non-political, honest, and efficient civil service has been a slow process with uneven results, and civil servants simply don't have the prestige and respect that they get in other countries. Anti-corruption efforts may have passed their peak. The Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United has made it impossible for Congress to rein in political donations. What use is a state law that limits a lobbyist to $50 when treating a legislator to lunch if that same legislator can use his campaign war chest as a personal ATM? During one legislative session, lawmakers dipped into campaign funds to spend $1.5 million on meals, $780,000 on golf, $168,000 on gifts, $88,000 on flowers, and $24,000 on hunting lodges and shooting ranges. About a third of campaign funds are spent on things that have nothing to do with campaigns. The Trump presidency lowered the ethical bar. Openly promoting his own businesses, Trump flaunted his conflict of interest. Attacking the deep state, he's tried to discredit the Justice Department and the FBI. In pardoning the likes of Manafort, Bannon, and Blagojevich, he signaled his indifference to corruption. Various monitors have demoted the US from around the 25th to around the 35th least corrupt country. Students of corruption agree that the least corrupt countries are healthier, happier, better educated, more prosperous, and more equal in terms of wealth and income. They suffer less crime and have smaller prison populations. The most corrupt nations do badly by these metrics, and the same applies to American states, including Louisiana. The 10 most corrupt spent more on law enforcement, more on jails, less on health, less on education and public welfare. They have more poverty and greater economic inequality. But despite providing poorer public services, state spending in the most corrupt states is per capita above average. State spending on wages and salaries is also higher. By one calculation, corruption amounts to a tax of $1,300 on every man, woman, and child in Louisiana. Still, the risk of a corrupt official being caught and going to jail has increased exponentially. The last 4 governors have restored a degree of integrity to state government. Stephen Street told me the other day that the investigations, indictments, and prosecutions are having a deterrent effect. He could well be right. Even the New Orleans Police Department, long a byword for corruption and brutality, has been cleaned up after a damning report by the DOJ and the sweeping consent decree of 2013. And yet, last year, 29 police officers were suspended for payroll fraud, double-dipping, falsifying timesheets, and so on. Bad, certainly, but evidence, perhaps, that the NOPD's public integrity section and the independent police monitor, approved by the Department of Justice, were doing their jobs. But no. The scam was in fact discovered by a chemistry professor at UNO doing his own private sleuthing. If auditors fail to audit, inspectors fail to inspect, and monitors fail to monitor, the bad old days are sure to return.